Last lesson, we learned about modernism as a cultural movement of the late 1800s and first half of the 20th century, in which artists reject and abandon traditions of the past and go by the rule to always make it in a new way or make it new. Some do this by creating artworks that are about art itself. The very characteristics of art making and its processes become the subject matter of the work. Some artists use abstraction to do this by analyzing or purifying things down to their essential parts to reveal the essence and truth of a subject. So this class, I want to look at the other aspect of modernism, the other side of modernism. The other aspect of modernism that I want to talk about today is that some artists make work that reacts directly to new theories of the human mind that come through the emergence of psychology, or the works respond to the violent times of upheaval they're living in. These artists wanted art to bring about change and improve society. They were idealistic and believed art had a role to play in creating a better world. There's a real fascination with the human mind and how it functions, even the physiology of vision, of dreaming, and this all adds to a utopian impulse in art, all looking to rid themselves of the traditions and the old ways and change and reform society in radical ways. Modernist artists responded directly to the upheaval of the world around them. As we learned in a previous lesson, the late 1800s were a time of fierce nationalism, empire-making, and at home in Europe, that meant intense militarization. In other words, lots of money spent on tanks, machine guns, armaments, and troops. So a lot of nationalist rhetoric, competition for colonies abroad, and competition for territory and old slights and disagreements with competing nations, so with neighboring countries. And so they made a series of alliances against and with each other, and they believed that somehow these alliances were going to keep them from going to war. And this overconfidence in nationalism and the superiority of their particular nation, one nation over another, became dangerous for everyone. And despite this, no one believed it would end in war, and in fact, by 1914, a set of alliances made by European rulers get them into an intractable war with their neighbors. And it's a war like Europe had never experienced before. Millions of people died, old empires collapsed, and many people thought that society would never be the same, and it was not. And so they called it the Great War because they believed that it would be the war to end all wars. And because it was a machine-enhanced war, it was very destructive. And many believed that the catastrophe demonstrated that human beings' overconfidence in technology was out of control, an overconfidence about reason and science. And so artists wanted to propose a society that was more humane and based on peace and beauty and truth, and they wanted to confront the majority who perhaps believed in the ideas of the war, felt very nationalistic, and the artists wanted to wake them up. And so they were happy to confront them in various ways that disturbed audiences. Artists believed at this time that in order to build a new society, a new utopia, artists would have to get involved and be active. This was the right time to call for utopias because the first quarter of the 20th century was a time of war and revolution. So artists react in different ways with socially engaged art, politically engaged art that develops their own styles or manifestos and approaches. It varies, but they all share this idealism about how art can be involved with social change. One characteristic of modernism is a fascination with the human mind and its workings. Not only how vision and the human brain works for vision and perception, as we saw in Impressionism, but in fact influenced by new ideas about the mind that emerge in the late 1880s onward, coming from Sigmund Freud, physician operating in Vienna. He had a special technique of putting his patients in an office, sitting on a couch, talking about their problems, as opposed to putting them in an asylum, which had been the previous method. So he asked them to talk about their problems, and he used that to research and develop his theories. So essentially, his theories about the invention, the identification of the human psyche or the unconscious, this founds in some way the discipline of psychology. And the concept of a subconscious or an unconscious really lights up artistic people, writers, performers, artists who really want to explore this new territory. And it's a way of looking at the human mind and why we do what we do that gets away from the church and tradition and all the kind of moral and mannerly codes that the 19th century was so stuck on. So this is a kind of response to the new science of the 19th century, but it's also a way for artists and the young people of the early 20th century to say, we want to get rid of old traditions and we want a new way of thinking about how human beings function. So artists make direct responses to these new ideas. And so this theory of psychoanalysis that he puts forward is essentially that human beings operate according to instinctual drives, but unfortunately these drives are repressed. So the unconscious of the human being, even though it's determining what we do, it's repressed, and this causes suffering and all our problems. So they really believed in the utopian thinking that by freeing the subconscious, by freeing the unconscious impulses, they would free society and emancipate culture and have the society that they dreamed of. So in literature, I don't have time to really go into this too much, but in literature, what the key thing is stream of consciousness, which you've probably all read examples of, but it's really where using the combinations of opposites, of juxtaposing elements that would not normally be together to kind of jolt the reader, or by trying to portray the stream of consciousness kind of experience, human experience, in words within novels or poems or theater. That's really how this takes shape in modernist literature. And you have very different writers, from poets like Ezra Pound, who suggested or proposed this maxim of modernism to make it new, T.S. Eliot, James Joyce, and writers like Virginia Woolf and Gertrude Stein, among many others. So André Breton was a poet who worked as a medic in a psychiatric hospital during the First World War, and he encountered the work of Freud through his work there. And particularly, the patients he was working with were shell shock victims from the First World War. So young men come back from the front who were completely traumatized. And so he saw firsthand some of the impact of this theory about what was going on in the human mind, and how they needed new theories and new strategies to work with the consciousness and the unconscious. And so, as a poet, Breton proposed an art movement that would do just that, that would attempt to free up the repressed sexual urges, the repressed unconscious impulses of society. The Surrealists believed that part of what was wrong with European culture was that it was so repressed. And so by making artworks that would shock people, that would give them a jolt, that would bring about change in people's minds and their thinking, and give them a kind of freed consciousness. And so that becomes the aim and project of Surrealism. This is an example of what I'm talking about when I say juxtaposition. So we have a juxtaposition of opposites. We have a china, cup, and saucer and spoon, which may represent or symbolize all the niceties of polite, mannered society of the late 1800s or the early 20th century. But the artist, Merritt Oppenheim, has covered it in fur. And so the thinking at the time, the interpretation at the time, was that fur was everything wild, natural, free, that animals, of course, pursue all their impulses and no impulses are repressed. And so for the Surrealists, animal instincts and urges, these are things that they want human beings to get closer to, or and acknowledge in themselves, and in so doing, release their repressed desires and free up their consciousness. And in doing so, they would be less violent, they would be less barbaric in war, they would get into less fights with each other. So their hope was that you could have a utopian version of society if everyone was just more aware of what was going on in their unconscious. This is another example of juxtaposition of opposites, or playing with an audience expectation and stymieing it in surrealism. Dada is an anti-war and anti-conformity movement that strikes up in Zurich but spreads during World War II across Europe and into New York. It's amazingly interdisciplinary. They use visual arts, poetry, manifestos, lots of performance, and crazy graphic design in theater. They innovate with collage. They're very interdisciplinary, so the artist uses whatever tools they want. And what is critically important about Dada is that it is against war, and it is against the kind of art and cultural norms that the middle classes that support the war like. So they attack art by making art that looks badly made, that looks ridiculous, and that sends up and critiques their society.